On today's World Insight, the feared fall COVID-19 surge has hit North America and Europe. What can we learn from China's strategy to control the pandemic?
The cold temperature and the dry sort of air actually may help survival of virus.
And America's two presidential candidates are polar opposites in climate policy. Does global cooperation on climate change hinge on the U.S. election? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin with the resurgent COVID-19 pandemic. Global spikes in confirmed cases sound the alarm bells for incoming winter. Worldwide cases topped 40 million, according to Johns Hopkins University. In Europe, widespread infections forced several countries to reissue curfews and other restrictions. And in the United States, which leads the confirmed cases, it is seeing a record number of daily infections. Number of new cases even surged to nearly 89,000 last Saturday. Here in China, new asymptomatic and imported cases have also been reported. The city of Kashgar in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region identified 164 new asymptomatic cases of COVID-19 as of Monday. It's the highest number of new symptomless infections since China began reporting such cases in April. For more on COVID-19 latest development, we are joined by Sheng, Dean and Bayer Distinguished Professor with the School of Pharmaceutical Sciences, Tsinghua University. Professor Dean, what a pleasure to see you.
Thanks for having me.
About the latest situation, the outbreak in Xinjiang, Kashgar, particularly regarding the asymptomatic patients. What do you make of the latest development?
I think it's still early to really determine how actually those infected individuals get this infection and how actually they can further develop. So far, we only learned most of them are asymptomatic, but perhaps as time goes along, some of them may actually develop disease symptoms.
Having said that, though, mainly people are looking at 4 counties in Kashgar, and one central area is one factory there. Many of those asymptomatic patients are directly or indirectly related to that factory. What do we know now?
Yes, still early to tell, but certainly we know it's getting actually into the winter season. Certainly the temperature and actually also people getting actually more often indoor with poor ventilation could be partially the reason actually why in a sort of a small factory or a smaller group actually can get infected actually when there's a certain individual carry the virus.
We have already seen a very long stretch of time when China did not see such a huge number of symptomatic or asymptomatic patients, but now there is a sudden outbreak apparently. What does it say about the current stage of China's prevention and control? And will China still be able to showcase its practices as the best, as some consider?
China has already more than 6 to 8 months in such really well-developed control strategy to really contain the viral spreading. And again, from the last several months, we don't really see much spread or new cases, especially actually during the national holiday where actually people travel, a significant number of people actually travel extensively. And again, we already passed actually incubation period. From that actually period of time, we didn't really see any very significant spike in terms of viral transmission. So overall, I think the strategy actually has worked really well. Certainly now we're really entering the winter season. Again, more people actually are indoor actually more often, again with perhaps poor ventilation given the cold weather. And also the cold temperature and the dry sort of air actually somewhat may help viral sort of survival, virus survival and the spreading. But again, with this overall strategy in China, I personally do have confidence.
Professor Ding, how would you characterize this China approach? What exactly are some of the most important points?
Again, sort of without a vaccine, the most effective control strategy is really, again, the physical distancing, wearing a mask, and also really quickly trace the infected individual and also quarantine those infected individuals. I mean, that's still the most effective strategy in the absence of vaccine.
Testing is very important. We see the first patients, the asymptomatic patients, the reason she was discovered is because of the random testing that had been taking place in her region. And so how do you see the scale of testing that's needed when the winter season approaches?
Yeah, again, I think you mentioned this really important strategy, testing. Again, sort of China really employed a significant testing whenever an individual is identified with the potential viral infection, and again, testing of the individual and also the close contact is immediately conducted. And also in some regions, very substantial testing, for example, in Qingdao, as we heard a few weeks back, actually, people in the entire city were tested with a pooled sample strategy to really save some sort of cost. So those strategies actually are really being employed and also tested how actually this can really identify the infected individual.
On the other hand, you talk about the vaccine, Professor Ding. Among the 12 vaccine candidates that have been coming into the third stage trial, clinical trial, it's reported 5 are being researched in China. So how should we understand the China's capability so far in terms of providing so-called global common good, both for its own population and also for the rest of the world?
Yeah, you're right. Actually, currently, I think there are 12 vaccines in phase 3 trials, perhaps 14, more than 14 in the phase 2 trial. Overall, vaccine developers are progressing through, the late-stage clinical trials. But so far, we have not heard any reported interim analysis of those phase 3 trials. So far, the safety profile looks quite promising, but we don't really know the efficacy yet. What we also heard from the developers is a significant number of individuals, special people actually, were also vaccinated. So far, no significant safety risk actually was reported.
Professor Ding, earlier there were quite optimistic mood in the air, shall we put it that way, when people think about the process of, vaccine research and the eventual results worldwide. But now it seems that things are not developing as fast as people would like it to be, at least, or as smoothly as one would wish, which is only natural when it comes to scientific research. So, Professor Ding, can we still see a time frame about a certain time as vaccines, whether it work or not, will be able to have certain results? And from there to, let's say, mass population having vaccines for COVID-19, how far are we talking about?
Actually, we're really near sort of the reporting of phase 3 data. Some project actually this month and perhaps early next month we'll see at least a few of those developers would report interim analysis of the phase 3 vaccine trials. So far, again, all the data actually point to a promising sort of outcome, but we really need to see the actual data from those analyses. So I think, again, overall timeline actually is still reasonable, we'll be seeing actually the results in a month or two. Really, by the end of the year, we will know some sort of answers and outcome from those trials. If things actually, again, the criteria for approving or for granting sort of early use of those vaccines is actually relatively not a very high bar. 50% efficacy actually would be approvable. Again, that 50% efficacy would already provide actually quite some protection for alleviating COVID-19 sort of spreading. So with that, actually, it can still be expected towards the end of the year we'll have perhaps one or two sort of vaccine actually be available. But to really provide actually mass vaccination, actually that actually would require still sort of a few months. I think perhaps towards mid next year, actually very large. If things still go as actually what we see now, smoothly, perhaps actually in the coming 6 months, actually we can expect perhaps really mass vaccination to really alleviate the global threat of this pandemic.
We are seeing the winter time coming, and flu season certainly already with us. And we have seen the rise numbers of flus in China and elsewhere in the world too. So how complicated will things be?
Yeah, certainly we're getting into the winter season of flu and other, coronavirus actually. Those respiratory sort of diseases actually may get actually worse. And actually, again, the winter temperature and actually people's behavior actually typically will not really help, the COVID pandemic situation. So again, I think the advice actually from healthcare experts really getting the flu vaccine early, especially for elderly, for high risk population, having sort of a flu vaccine actually taken would actually alleviate hospital burden. And those actually would be some activity we do now.
About the availability vis-a-vis the necessity, how do you see this relationship?
Yeah, that's actually a very important question because, I think the situation is really due to, in the past, the flu vaccine actually is not really widely used during the winter season. That's why the developers and manufacturers are actually have not really prepared actually to really manufacture a large sort of amount of vaccine actually for the winter season. But now actually in the pandemic situation, COVID-19 pandemic situation, there's actually increased needs of flu vaccine. Certainly in a short time, actually it's hard for those manufacturers to scale up the flu vaccine manufacture. I think this is again, it's a situation we're facing now. But certainly each government, each country actually would really look into this situation and really consider and prepare for the future flu vaccine manufacturers.
Professor Ding, what about the antibody vaccine vis-a-vis antibody, and also those COVID-19 patients, they develop antibody and their current situation now, Professor?
Yeah, what we know is really several companies actually have been really developing neutralizing antibody for this virus actually in clinical trials. Regeneron, for example, we heard about President Trump actually received the Regeneron's neutralizing antibody in his sort of a case, and it was touted as sort of a cure or something. Certainly, we've heard quite a bit about such neutralizing antibodies magic effect. So that's have been really going on well. And again, Regeneron and the two U.S. companies, Regeneron and Eli Lilly, actually applied for emergency authorization use. for COVID-19 patients. However, what is really very recently announced by Eli Lilly is really they are actually terminating their neutralizing antibody trial for hospitalized patients. That really means actually such neutralizing antibody was not actually that effective in severe hospitalized patient population. Regeneron and Eli Lilly are continuing their trials in mild to moderate disease patient population, as well as actually further testing the antibodies' utility in prophylactic situation. Really means in the healthy individual, in terms of preventing the infection. Given sort of so far what we understood about this virus and the disease progression development.
What does that mean in terms of how prevention and control can be done through the use of antibody?
Yeah, I mean, again, sort of the trial, the neutralizing antibody trial data, as well as our understanding of COVID-19 disease is really in the early stage of the disease. It's mostly driven by the viral replication during this early stage when patients still exhibit mild to moderate disease symptom. At this stage, actually, neutralizing or stopping viral replication could be most effective. That's where actually we see, remdesivir, this antiviral drug from Gilead, and also more recently, the neutralizing antibodies effect. However, as the disease actually progress actually from mild, moderate to severe situation, the disease is no longer driven by the viral infection. It's mostly due to our host immune system overreaction, overactivation. So that disease condition would need to be treated actually by other medications. So in terms of actually controlling the virus, again, importantly, early identification of the infection is important, and at such early time point, actually, treating the infected individual with neutralizing antibody, with antiviral drug remdesivir as such, actually could be really more effective, useful in terms of controlling those patients not progressing through into the severe situation. I think that's really the promise.
We've seen the numbers in the United States, for example, and in some of the European countries spiked. So what kind of situation are we facing right now? According to the WHO Director General, he talked about sacrifice for prevention and control.
Again, I think one reason is perhaps we're really getting into the cold, in the northern hemisphere, we're really getting into the sort of the cold temperature. Again, sort of how this virus spreads, and also how people behave actually may really contribute to this sort of a spike. And also, people gotten used to sort of the situation. So I think especially such difficult time, actually emphasizing on physical distancing and the mask wearing actually it's really important.
And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program today, setting the record straight on China's efforts to curb climate change, while playing the blame game does no favors for the environment. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Now let's go to the global efforts against climate change and promote biodiversity. This time we look at the relations between China and the United States as reflected on this issue. In response to U.S. accusations against China on the environment, the Chinese Foreign Ministry recently has published a fact sheet on environmental damage by the U.S. and the damage that its flip-flopping policies did to global environmental governance. The report suggests that historically the U.S. has produced the world's most greenhouse gas emissions, although China has now replaced it as the number one. And that the U.S. President Donald Trump's policy reversals put a damper on climate change efforts. It quotes a recent report from the New York Times suggesting that Trump's administration has reversed the 72 environmental policies and is challenging 27 more. The changes could lead to a rise in emissions and deaths from air pollution. The U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, widely considered as seriously undermined efforts on climate change. And also, there are accusations around the world about the inefficiency and missteps in protecting biodiversity and wildlife from the U.S. side, as well as waste and chemical management. But about the latest of that issue regarding the U.S. and its future policy directions, let's go to our panelists. For the latest development regarding the U.S. And its policies on climate change and biodiversity, we are joined in Washington, D.C. by Wu Changhua, Executive Director from the Professional Association for China's Environment, and also in New York, Jeffrey Sachs, Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. In Beijing, Zhang Jianyu, Chief Representative of Environmental Defense Fund China Program. Let me begin by asking you, Professor Sachs, election coming up, likely the ideas about environmental protection and sustainable development in the policy line make huge difference between the two candidates?
We couldn't have a bigger difference. Trump is really an enemy of the environment, and his whole political orientation is to fossil fuels, to deregulation, to profits over sustainability. Whereas Vice President Biden has called for action against climate change and protection of the environment. So this is one of the starkest choices that we've ever had in an election. The consequences will be very, very high.
Of course, Mr. Biden, one of the candidates, have been suggesting that climate change will be the #1 challenge for human society. However, Mr. Sachs, how much do you think that will really make a difference in terms of how people vote on November the 3rd?
It makes some difference. Trump carries votes typically in states that produce a lot of coal and where there's more production of oil and gas. He tends, on average, to get more support. Biden gets more support of young people who know that their future depends on us taking global cooperative actions to fight climate change. So there is an effect on the election. Of course, many other things are also part of the political choice, but this issue is one of the consequential issues.
Mr. Zhang, you've been working with your colleagues based in Washington and elsewhere in the U.S. What's your take about the latest U.S. policy lines toward climate change and environmental protection?
Part of that is politics, as Professor Sachs just said, but I think part of that is going to be one of the biggest challenge that the entire human being are facing. Climate change, the environmental protection requires global cooperation. Not one single nation can take it on, no matter how big you are. And U.S. has been a major part of the game of this campaign fighting climate change, at least in the former administration. So putting the politics aside, I think no matter what's the outcome on November 3rd, I think the fight is still on, and we will still require, one way or another, one degree or another, of a global collaboration, whether it is at the national level, at the UN level, or at the subnational level, or at the private sector level, or at the individual level.
Mm-hmm.
So from an environmentalist perspective, we just hope that after the election, we can put all the differences aside, still trying to figure out a way to go forward.
Ms. Wu, will that likely to happen, or is it more of a wishful thinking, given the internal politics inside the U.S. and also the huge divide about visions for climate change and environmental protection in the U.S. as well, particularly in the years to come, when the economies are not necessarily going to do an immediate recovery?
It's going to be a very tough call. I think I agree with Jeffrey that, in 8 days, we're going to see the presidential election outcome. And
hopefully, I'm not sure whether we're really going to see the outcome, but hopefully.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We'll see. Fingers crossed, actually. On one side, of course, we recognize climate change is an essential threat. But on the other hand, actually, there are many other challenges, including actually, there are about 8 million people in the U.S. actually slip back to poverty, right? If you look at, millions of people basically today facing challenges of putting food on their table, right? And whether they're going to be evicted out of their current housing or not. So the situation is more complicated, meaning the challenges are much more daunting than just looking at climate change issues there. So on one side, probably we could say, this is a sort of a reset, a great reset opportunity because, we're going to build back better, right? On the other hand, we have more challenges, more urgent issues actually to address. So I think it's going to, at the end of the day, it's going to be a very difficult situation. On the positive side, though, even though at the federal level in the U.S. we've witnessed the political complexity here around the climate change issues there are people, there are leaders at the national level, at corporate level, at the local level. They are still taking actions. They are very committed actually to fight climate change and particularly actually integrating renewable energy, clean technologies with this sort of the job creation, right? If you look at the Biden's economic plan, it's very exciting to see actually, clean energy, clean infrastructure, pretty much the core part of his strategy of the new economic plan. So I'm really hoping that if Biden wins, the situation in the U.S. will fundamentally shift towards a new direction.
We would love to see hope is the way out, but hope is not a strategy as we have known, particularly over the past few years. Professor Sachs, so let's check into some of the realities. Some have been making comments about the U.S. performance over the past few years, particularly regarding the Kyoto Protocol and the Convention on Biodiversity. U.S. has failed to sign up to that, and certainly not to mention implementation. So will there be a dramatic change, whether there's a change of presidency or not? How much political battles need to be fought out if there is going to be a dramatic change?
Because our politics are divided, a lot will depend on next week's outcome. There really is a world of difference between Trump and Biden, first of all. Trump is, in my personal opinion, the worst president we've ever had in American history. He's certainly an enemy to any kind of environmental protection. Biden would be vastly better. If the Democrats win the House and the Senate and the White House, that's the best outcome from my point of view, then we will see federal legislation and we will begin a national level fight against climate change. Right now, we do have states and cities that are taking action, but it's a little bit like controlling COVID-19 also. We have a collapse at the federal level. We have states and cities trying to do something, but it's very hard to make progress if at the national level you have a government that is antagonistic to either controlling a pandemic or fighting against climate change. So a lot really will depend on the election outcome. It's going to be close in some sense, But if it goes the way of a Biden victory and a Democratic victory in both houses of Congress, I would expect to see very significant legislative action and policy change. Given that China has now announced net zero by 2060 in terms of its emissions, given that Europe has announced net zero by 2050, and given that today Japan has now announced net zero by 2050, the world is moving in the right direction, and the U.S. would join the rest of the world in a cooperative effort if Trump is defeated and President Biden would rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, and if there's enough support for the Democrats, would be able to make a significant change of national policy as well.
Two things to follow up, if I can, Professor Sachs. First of all, if you look at the Pew Research polls being conducted in different states of the United States, you will see some very different opinions about climate change issues and environmental protection issues. Some are very for it and extremely high, the supporting rate 70 to 80% even in some states. However, in others, the numbers are extremely low. So the divide that you have among states, you earlier talked about some of the leadership in the states and local level, there's going to be a huge difference also about that as well. And that certainly is going to infiltrate into the national policies that can be implemented.
There are many divides in America. The older white population is more conservative. They don't watch CGTN, they watch Fox News, which is filled with lies every day, and is a pro-coal, pro-oil television station. So they get very distorted news. People who live in states that produce coal, I think this is true everywhere in the world, are more resistant to change to what we need, which is wind and solar and hydropower, clean energy. So a lot depends on where people live, it depends on their age, it depends on their source of information. But the good news is most Americans, around 70% of Americans, understand the truth on this issue. But there are pockets of resistance and, unfortunately, politically powerful pockets of resistance. So wealthy people in the oil, gas, and coal industry, they spend a lot of money, they pay money to politicians. It's a corrupt business, in my opinion, and it is part of the story of resistance and needed change.
I see.
But the world is coming around because the crisis is very, very deep. After all, we had our whole Pacific coast of the United States on fire with massive fires this year because of the climate change. So the realities are hitting home. They're burning down homes. But Trump represents the old guard. He's a reactionary. He looks to the past. I hope the future wins this election.
Another question related to that, Professor Sachs, is the unpredictability of the U.S. leadership in terms of environmental issues and climate change issues. You said earlier some of the previous administrations have been putting emphasis on it. However, over the past few years, we have seen this unpredictability huge from the United States that make the rest of the world, when drawing plans, when thinking about cooperation, when thinking about technology development, all have to ponder about what's going to be the U.S. attitude and what's going to be its role. And sometimes it's a progressive role, sometimes it's very much pulling everybody down. So what do you make of that unpredictability in terms of U.S. leadership, if there is still any leadership left in this regard?
Well, again, I would say for China, for example, just proceed. If the U.S. Falls farther and farther behind, China should just become leader in the clean technologies. China wants clean air anyway. It wants a safe climate anyway. But if the U.S. is laggard, China should produce the good electric vehicles. It should produce the photovoltaics, it should produce the wind turbines, it should produce the long-distance smart grids. If the United States doesn't participate, China will then have an even wider demand for these products. So in no sense would I suggest that China or Europe should wait for the United States. I'm worried, of course, for the world, that if the United States lags behind, it hurts the whole world, but it also hurts the United States because it hurts our own future competitiveness. If we're producing 20th or even 19th century technology while China is producing 21st century technology, this is no good for the United States. So it's simply self-defeating. Trump, in my view, is a fool. He's in the wrong direction entirely, but he doesn't understand. So that's why we really need a change of leadership.
One could see your political choice very clear, Professor Sachs.
But just to explain,
issue.
If I may, you know, it's not because I'm a partisan. It's not because I'm a Democrat or a Republican. I want the world to be safe for my children and my grandchildren. And so I'm aghast when I see a president like Trump. He makes everything dangerous, even for the virus. He makes it dangerous. So it's not that I'm a partisan in a political sense. It's that I understand that we need safety for the world. I want safety for my family. I want safety for humanity. And that's why I speak in these terms. Because unfortunately, the president is a dangerous person, our U.S. president.
We appreciate that you're sharing your thoughts with us, Professor Sachs. Just for your information, 7,000 Tesla vehicles were exported to the European market from the China factory Tesla set up in Shanghai just 2 days ago. So very interesting development, certainly. To the other two panelists, also some of the important issues Professor Sachs touched on. Ms. Wu, China is not necessarily interested in certainly challenging any leadership or competing for the so-called leadership, but a plan, a world plan, and every country contributing to the plan is very crucial. Ms. Wu, China put out a very grand goal, as Professor Sachs mentioned. Is there any chance that that could be reached? Through what?
Basically, there are two critical timelines. 2030, no later than 2030, China will achieve peaking its emissions. And of course, by 2060, we're going to achieve net zero carbon emissions. And that's pretty much the roadmap, the mission, actually, the vision the country has signed up to already. Those are not just numbers or words or timelines. China, there's plenty of research supporting the decision-making process, and the conclusion was pretty much drawn from those research, serious research actually, and then China made a commitment. And as Jeffrey mentioned earlier, EU, of course, and has also committed to this 2050 net zero carbon future. And globally, going back to the Paris Agreement, which has pretty much drawn the blueprint and also the roadmap for humanity to fight climate change and to transform how we grow our economy, how we manage our resources there, is very, very clear. I think by 2050, a net zero carbon society is pretty much a globally adopted or shared vision already. Now, how do we get there? China, of course, as the largest developing country, we made our commitment, sort of aligned with that timeline. In the meantime, China is also not a simple task of just by saying that tomorrow we're going to definitely just deliver that, but rather it requires a tremendous effort. It requires a policy targets at the level of ambition that's aligned with the global effort, and it requires investment and financing. It requires technology innovation. It also, very importantly, actually, it requires collaboration and partnership. One point I do want to pick up, actually, from the point Jeffrey mentioned early on. I don't think it's just a competitiveness issue. This is a moral issue, because we're talking about it's about it's a substantial threat.
Before you go, Professor, final question for you, that is, you know, we have seen the changes of concepts and the changes of focus of attention being evolving from climate change only to also climate change plus biodiversity and some of the other important concepts. So how do you see these combined, and how much effort do you think advocacy has to be made to the public, particularly with the division you have inside the United States?
We have a whole big environmental crisis. And in that crisis, there are at least three major parts. There's the human climate change, there's the destruction of biodiversity, and there's the massive pollution. And so we need to handle all three of these in a coherent way. That's why when Europe adopted the European Green Deal, it is for decarbonization. It is for circular economy, so-called, to reduce the pollution, and it is what they call farm-to-fork policy for sustainable land use. We need all of those. China will be hosting a major summit on biodiversity next year, and it should be combined with the climate agenda, because we need also to store carbon in the soils and in the trees. We need to reforest as part of the climate solution, but also we want to save biodiversity as well. And let me just reiterate that President Obama and President Xi Jinping worked hand in hand for the success of the Paris Climate Summit in December 2015. So cooperation is possible. Let's not lose heart or lose hope, because there really is hope if we can get that political change in the United States.
Jeffrey Sachs, Zhang Jianyu, Wu Changhua, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and be safe wherever you are. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search World Insight. That's the name of the program. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.